In today's video, we'll be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went terribly wrong. The first story involves a terrifying situation where the human body is twisted in ways it was never meant to endure. The second is just as suffocating and intense. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. On December 27, 2003, a group of 8 boys from the San Antonio Boy Village, along with 2 counselors, headed toward Boy Scout Cave in Florida. Among them were Michael Shiro, age 15, and Javik Henderson, 16, 2 adventurous teens eager to prove their courage in the labyrinthine depths of the cave. Their counselors decided to stay behind, citing their size as a reason they wouldn't be able to navigate the tight passageways. The cave was known for its narrow tunnels and sharp bends, but was considered safe because of its stable structure and dry conditions. The group, armed with only 9 flashlights, began their descent shortly after midday. The temperature inside dropped to a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit as they moved deeper inside. One counselor who stayed at the entrance lit a small campfire to stay warm, unaware that this seemingly harmless act would later add a grim twist to the unfolding nightmare. Michael and Henderson led the group deeper into the cave. The air was still, almost chokingly silent, as the boys crawled and twisted through the constricting tunnels. Despite the cave's safe reputation, its tight confines bred a sense of unease. The deeper they went, the more the crushing darkness pressed in around them. Roughly an hour into their journey, they reached a particularly difficult part of the cave, known as the hairpin curve. The group paused to assess the challenge. The absence of their counselors began to weigh heavily, the guidance and strength of an adult figure sorely missed. Michael, determined to lead, crawled forward into the hairpin curve. This passage in Boy Scout Cave was a natural choke point, a narrow horizontal slit in the rock, with small turns just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. The path then curved abruptly at an almost 180-degree angle, forming a blind turn that hid what lay beyond. Damp, jagged limestone walls surrounded them. The floor was uneven and scattered with rocks and debris, while the low ceiling forced anyone passing through to contort their body in painful ways. This passage was tighter than anything they'd encountered so far. Michael forced his way through, with Henderson following closely behind. Henderson had to twist his body, turning awkwardly to get through the sharp bend. Suddenly, he stopped. He couldn't move forward or back. His breath quickened as the reality hit him. He was stuck, his body unnaturally twisted. Michael, just ahead of him, noticed his struggle and shifted back to help. The rest of the group waited anxiously in the larger section of the tunnel, their nervous voices bouncing faintly off the narrow rock walls. Michael maneuvered himself into the tight gap to assist his friend. The sharp limestone pressed into their skin as they fought to shift positions. The cave's quiet was soon replaced by frantic breathing and muffled cries as Michael tried to free Henderson. The struggle drained their energy, every small motion a painful effort. Henderson's body was wedged in tightly, sharp rocks digging into his ribs and hips, sending jolts of pain through every inch of him. His limbs bent unnaturally, the pressure constant and overwhelming, making it feel as though the cave was slowly crushing him alive. As the minutes dragged on, turning into an hour, Michael began to feel the effects of the cold and exhaustion. Though the cave's temperature was mild, the boys' bodies began losing heat due to their limited movement and constant contact with the cold stone. Then, things got worse. Michael's vision started to blur. His muscles weakened as he continued trying to push and pull his friend free. Without warning, Michael collapsed, his body slumping lifelessly against the rock. Panic surged through Henderson as he realized his friend was unconscious. Trapped and unable to move, he could only cry for help, his voice echoing through the narrow passageway. The boys in the wider area were thrown into chaos. They scrambled to understand what had just happened. Their flashlights began to flicker as batteries ran low. It became clear they were in over their heads. With Michael passed out and Henderson stuck, their earlier confidence turned into fear. The air seemed heavier, amplifying the dread. Some of the boys began to panic, convinced that the fire outside the cave was eating up all the oxygen. They decided they needed to get out before the situation got worse. At that point, every one of them was running on borrowed time. Nobody wanted to leave Michael and Henderson behind, but they realized they had no choice. Knowing they couldn't free their friends alone, they made the heartbreaking decision to crawl back toward the entrance and call for help. Outside, the counselors were completely unaware of the disaster unfolding below. When the boys reached them, out of breath and panicked, they could barely explain what had happened. The counselors quickly put out the fire, their faces turning pale as they realized the gravity of the situation. One counselor dialed emergency services immediately, while the other tried to comfort the boys, though the weight of what was happening was impossible to ignore. Within the hour, professional rescue teams began arriving. The first responders were trained cavers, but they knew they were facing a difficult task. Boy Scout Cave was notorious for its narrow spaces, and carrying equipment through them added a whole new layer of difficulty. Fears of low oxygen inside the cave added urgency to the mission. When rescuers reached the group, the boys were huddled together, pale and crying. The cave was thick with fear and the imagined threat of suffocation. Rescuers did their best to reassure them while evaluating the situation. Later expert assessments revealed the oxygen levels were fine. It turned out the panic had triggered a psychological reaction, leading the boys to believe the air was toxic. In truth, the air was safe, and the fear had been largely mental. Still, Michael and Henderson were in serious danger. Michael's condition was critical. His unconscious state was a stark reminder of the dire situation. The rescuers worked with renewed urgency, chiseling away at the rock to create enough space to extract him. Every second felt like an eternity as they fought against the unyielding limestone. After nearly 2 hours, they finally freed Michael. His body was cold to the touch, his pulse weak, but present. Carefully, they secured him in a harness and began the slow, arduous process of bringing him to the surface. Every step through the narrow passages was a struggle. The rescuers' bodies ached as they navigated the labyrinth. When they finally emerged from the cave, the scene was one of urgent relief. Emergency medical teams were waiting, gear in hand, prepared to fight off the onset of hypothermia. Michael and Henderson were rushed to the hospital, receiving immediate treatment. Both boys survived, but were severely hypothermic. It took Michael an entire day to regain consciousness. In the aftermath, the counselor's decision to remain outside the cave, though made with good intentions, had left the boys without guidance. The lack of proper preparation and equipment had transformed a simple adventure into a life-threatening ordeal. The next Weatherly Well horror story involved a more experienced caver facing a challenge he never anticipated. On the chilly morning of February 11, 1998, a biting wind swept through the Tennessee woods as James Lewis, Alan England, Darl Moore, and Jerry Olen prepared for a caving expedition. Olson had recently discovered a cave during a ridge-walking trip and invited his seasoned companions to explore it. Known locally as Weatherly Well, the cave entrance presented an immediate obstacle, a narrow 9-inch wide slot leading 40 feet down. It was barely large enough for a single person to squeeze through at a time. From the surface, the group inspected the opening, wet, tight, and uninviting. Just beyond the slot, an 11-foot drop opened into a broader chamber, followed by a 10-foot descent deeper into the cave. The interior passage twisted like a corkscrew, giving off an ominous sense of claustrophobia. Though the group was experienced, this configuration demanded a meticulous approach. They laid out their gear with care, double-checked ropes and lines, and mentally prepared for what was ahead. Alan England, the oldest at 63 but still incredibly fit, and the smallest of the team, volunteered to go first. With a rope secured at the entrance as a handline, he began the descent. The entrance, a mere 9 inches wide, was challenging even for someone of his build. Taking a deep breath, he twisted and compressed his body to squeeze into the tight vertical slot, the moist rock walls catching his clothing as he wriggled downward. By the time he emerged into the chamber below, his shirt and pants were soaked, and his chest heaved from exertion. From there, gravity aided his descent. Using the rope, he carefully lowered himself into the next chamber. A 7-foot drop led into a slightly wider space, allowing him a moment to stretch. His headlamp swept across the cave's walls, revealing another 10-foot drop just ahead. England paused. The chamber beyond seemed even more treacherous, narrow, cold, and winding into darkness. Though tempted to continue, he understood the danger of proceeding alone. The next drop would require more rope work, and without a partner to assist, it was simply too risky. The moisture in the air clung to his skin, and he was already chilled. Wisely, he decided to return. Ascending the 10-foot drop wasn't difficult. Years of caving had made his movements efficient. He gripped the rope, found solid footing, and climbed with practiced ease. But as he approached the base of the slot he'd entered through, a troubling realization struck him. What gravity had made easy during his descent now loomed as an insurmountable challenge. The narrow slot from below appeared even tighter. He positioned himself to climb through it and pulled using the rope for leverage. But as he neared the top, he couldn't push further. The rock pressed in on all sides. His already fatigued muscles screamed as he tried to maneuver. The cold had set deep into his limbs. His soaked clothing clung to him, making every movement more difficult. From above, Lewis and Moore noticed him struggling. They tried pulling on the rope to help, but the tight opening offered no room for movement. Each tug only seemed to wedge him further into the rock. Panic and exhaustion began to set in. England's hands trembled, his body racked by cold. The cave's narrow grip became a vice, pressing into his chest and sides. The winter air funneled into the cave, turning it into a freezer. He began to shiver uncontrollably, his breath shallow and rapid. Even expanding his chest to breathe became difficult. Lewis and Olsen scrambled to help. They lowered extra clothing and a thermos of warm drink, hoping to stave off the cold. England forced himself to sip, trying to hold off the encroaching numbness. But the minutes dragged on. Finally, he called up, voice strained. He couldn't do this anymore. They needed to get help. Without hesitation, Lewis and Olsen hiked back to Olsen's house and contacted the East Tennessee Cave Rescue Team. Within 2 hours, a team of experienced rescuers arrived, carrying specialized tools and hauling systems. When they reached England, he had been trapped for nearly 5 hours. His skin was pale, his body trembling. The pain was overwhelming, and his mind raced as he kept replaying the ease of his descent. Something now haunting. The rescuers assessed his condition and provided layers of insulation, warm fluids, and reassurance. The geometry of the slot, combined with England's position, made the extraction extraordinarily difficult. There was no room to maneuver. A complex pulley system was rigged to carefully lift him without causing harm. Every pull was deliberate and slow. The cave's rough stones scraped against his chest and shoulders, drawing blood, but England endured the pain in silence. After nearly an hour of excruciating effort, England emerged from the slot, battered but alive. The freezing air outside felt like a blessing compared to the oppressive cold inside. He was helped to his feet, body shaking from the ordeal, yet determined to walk back to the car on his own. His resilience was clear. Later, reflecting on the experience, England admitted he had underestimated the difficulty of exiting through the narrow shaft. The cave's tight confines had made it impossible to use his ascenders effectively, leaving him no choice but to depend on others for his survival.